She stood in the rain outside a mansion that used to hold her future, wearing clothes that didn't fit and boots held together with electrical tape. Military police vehicles rolled past the iron gate twice. Not one of them slowed down. To everyone in Redstone City, Emily Carter was just a nurse who'd come back wrong. Too quiet, too thin, 5 years of something nobody wanted to ask about written across her face. What they didn't know was that she'd spent those 5 years in a place most soldiers don't survive. What they really didn't know was that the dog she came back for, her military K9, her partner, her last living proof that any of it was real, was supposed to be dead. The records said so. The man who married her fiancé said so. But the records were wrong, and Emily Carter had survived worse than a lie. If this story has you hooked already, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The rain had been coming down for 3 hours by the time Emily found the address. She hadn't looked it up online. She'd written it on the back of her wrist in ballpoint pen on the bus from the transit station, the way she used to write grid coordinates when paper wasn't an option. Old habits. The kind that stick to a person whether they want them to or not. The house was bigger than she expected. Not that she'd been expecting much. Marcus had always talked about making something of himself, and she'd never doubted him, not once in the 4 years they'd been together before her deployment. But this was a different category of wealth. Iron fencing, security cameras on every corner, a Range Rover in the driveway next to a Tesla, both of them newer than anything Emily had ever owned, roses along the front path, the expensive kind that didn't grow wild. She stood at the gate for a long moment, water running down the back of her neck, and looked at the house the way she used to look at unfamiliar territory, cataloging exits, angles, blind spots. It was automatic. She wasn't proud of it. She pressed the intercom button once. The voice that came back wasn't Marcus's. It was a woman's. Clipped, slightly defensive, the voice of someone who'd learned to be cautious about strangers at the gate. "Who is this?" "Emily Carter," she said. "I'm looking for Marcus Webb." A long pause. 1 moment. She waited in the rain. A light went on in an upstairs window, then off again. Through the glass panel beside the front door, she could see movement. 2 shapes, close together, then one of them pulling away from the other. She recognized the way Marcus moved. Even after 5 years, she recognized it. The gate buzzed open. He met her on the front steps, not inside. That told her everything. He was wearing a gray sweater and dress shoes, the kind of man he'd always wanted to be. And he looked older in the way that people look older when they've been comfortable for a long time. He stopped at the top of the steps and looked at her the way you look at something you thought you'd already dealt with. "Emily." He said it like a word in a language he'd mostly forgotten. "Marcus." Neither of them moved toward the other. "I heard you were back," he said. "A couple weeks ago. I didn't know how to—" He stopped. Started again. "You look—" "I'm not here about us," she said. "I'm here about Shadow." Something shifted behind his eyes. Quick, almost invisible. She'd spent 5 years reading rooms and reading people, and she caught it. "Shadow," he repeated. "My dog. My K9. You were listed as the secondary contact for her welfare when I deployed. You were supposed to—" says she. "Emily." His voice dropped. "Careful now. Shadow passed away. It's been almost 3 years. What was the cause of death?" He blinked. "What?" "The cause of death. When a military working dog passes, there's a record. Necropsy report, handler notification, unit documentation. I submitted a formal inquiry through the Army 6 days ago. They sent me the record." She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and pulled out a folded paper, damp at the edges but legible. "Cardiac failure. She was 4 years old, Marcus. Belgian Malinois in service conditioning don't die of cardiac failure at 4 years old." The woman from the intercom appeared in the doorway behind him. Mid-30s, attractive, wearing a silk robe, and an expression that was working hard to stay neutral. Emily had seen the wedding announcement in a search result 3 years back, in a hospital in Germany, on a borrowed phone, and had felt something go out of her like a light switching off. She wasn't going to revisit that feeling tonight. You should come inside, Marcus said. I'm fine here. It's raining. I've been in worse. The woman, Diane, Emily remembered her name from the announcement, stepped forward slightly. Mr. Webb told me the dog passed naturally. I didn't have any reason to. I'm not here about you, Emily said calmly. I'm not here about any of this. She looked at Marcus. I just need to know where Shadow is. I told you, she's gone. The story doesn't add up, Emily said. The timeline doesn't add up. The medical record doesn't add up. I deployed with Shadow for 2 years before capture. I know her health history better than any vet who ever treated her. Cardiac failure at 4 is not what happened. She folded the paper and put it back. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think very carefully about what you say next, because I'm not angry, Marcus. I'm just trying to find her. Where is Shadow? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. I don't know what you want me to tell you, he said. The truth would be a start. The dog is dead, Emily. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear. She studied him. The way he was standing, weight shifted back, shoulders tight, not looking at her directly. She'd interrogated people for information under conditions that would break most civilians, and she knew the shape of a person who was lying. He wasn't lying the way people lie when they feel guilty. He was lying the way people lie when they're scared of something. She stepped back from the gate. Okay, she said. He seemed surprised. Okay? I'll figure it out on my own. She turned and walked back toward the street without another word. Behind her, she heard Diane say something quiet to Marcus, and heard his answer, lower still, clipped off at the end like he didn't want to say the rest of it out loud. She didn't look back. The motel she was staying in was called the Pinebrook Inn, which was optimistic because there were no pines visible from any window, and the brook was a drainage ditch behind the parking lot. But it was $42 a night and the lock worked, and after 5 years in places where neither of those things were guaranteed, Emily didn't have complaints. She spread what she had across the bed. The official death record from Army records, which she'd had to request 3 separate times before someone finally sent it. A copy of Shadow's deployment file, redacted in places but still useful. A map of Redstone City printed at a library the day she arrived, with animal shelters, rescue organizations, and veterinary clinics marked in red ink. A short list of names. People who'd known Shadow, people who'd been stationed with Emily before the capture, people who might know something. She'd started calling the shelters 2 days ago. Most of them had no records of a Belgian Malinois matching Shadow's description in the past 3 years. 2 of them had records of a dog that might be close, but the descriptions were vague and both trails went cold. She wasn't deterred. She'd spent 37 months in captivity surviving on less certainty than this. Shadow was alive. She didn't have evidence for that yet. She had something older and harder to explain. A certainty that sat in her chest the way the knowledge of danger had always sat there in the field. Not a feeling, a read. The story Marcus told had the shape of a cover, not a grief. She'd spent enough time around people hiding things to know the difference. She made a list of places to check in the morning and set her phone alarm for 5:30. Then she lay down in her clothes on top of the covers and was asleep inside of 4 minutes, the way combat-trained people learn to sleep, completely and without ceremony, because rest is a resource and wasting it is its own kind of failure. She found the first real lead on the 3rd day. It wasn't at a shelter. It was at a veterinary clinic on the east side of the city, a small practice run by a woman named Dr. Priya Osman, who worked primarily with large breeds and had a reputation in local rescue circles for taking in animals other clinics wouldn't touch. Emily had gotten her name from a woman at the second shelter who'd gotten it from someone else, the way information travels in small communities when it travels at all. Dr. Osman was in her late 40s, direct in the way of someone who'd spent decades dealing with creatures that couldn't tell her what was wrong. Belgian Malinois, military background, Emily said. Female, about 7 years old now, microchipped. I have the chip number. She slid a paper across the desk. Dr. Osman looked at it. This is a military working dog number, she said. Yes. Those dogs don't usually end up in civilian rescue. This one did, Emily said. Or she's somewhere that isn't a shelter. I don't know yet. I'm trying to narrow it down. Doctor? Osmond was quiet for a moment. She looked at Emily with the careful attention of someone deciding how much to say. Why come to me specifically? You take dogs other clinics won't touch. I figured if someone brought in a dog they didn't want records for, they might come here and hope you'd ask fewer questions. Dr. Osmond raised an eyebrow. That's not how I operate. I know, that's why I'm here. Because if someone brought a dog like that to you, you'd have logged it. You'd have records. A pause. You're former military. It wasn't a question, but Emily answered it anyway. Combat nurse, 5th Special Operations Group, 5 years ago. Something moved in Dr. Osmond's expression. Not quite recognition, but close. She turned to her computer. Chip number again. Emily read it off from memory. Dr. Osmond typed, waited. Then she stopped moving. That's strange, she said. Emily leaned forward slightly. What? I have a scan record in my system from 14 months ago. A Malinois brought in by a man who said she was a stray. No collar, malnourished, some old scarring on her hindquarters, consistent with... She stopped. Read something on her screen that Emily couldn't see. The chip number matches. The room went quiet in a way that Emily felt in her throat. Where did the man take her after? She asked. Her voice was steady. It took work to keep it that way. He didn't. Dr. Osmond turned to look at her. He never came back. I held her for the standard period, and then she hesitated. I placed her with a private rescue contact, someone I'd worked with before. He runs an informal operation out near the rail district. Name and address, Emily said. Dr. Osmond looked at her for a moment. You should know she wasn't in good condition when she came in. Whoever had her before wasn't... Name and address, Emily said again. Still quiet. Still level. Dr. Osmond wrote it on a prescription pad and slid it across the desk. The rail district was the part of Redstone City that the newer downtown didn't like to think about. Old switching yards, warehouses that had been repurposed and re-repurposed until they didn't look like anything in particular anymore. A grid of streets where the streetlights were mostly decorative. Emily walked it in the late afternoon. Her jacket zipped against the wind coming off the flat ground to the west, the address from Dr. Osmond's notepad in her pocket. The man's name was Garrett Finch, and he lived and operated out of what had once been a machine shop. She could hear dogs before she saw the building. Not barking, exactly. A lower, more exhausted sound. The kind of sound animals make when they've stopped expecting things. She knocked on the side door. A man opened it. 60s, unshaven, wearing a heavy flannel and carrying a towel that had seen better days. He looked at her with the immediate wariness of someone who got unexpected visitors with some regularity and none of them pleasant. Garrett Finch? Depends. Priya Osmond sent me. About a dog she placed with you 14 months ago. Belgian Malinois. Adult female. His expression shifted. Not relief, something more complicated than that. You better come in, he said. The inside of the machine shop smelled like hay and disinfectant and dog, and was warmer than the outside by about 15 degrees. There were crates along the walls, most of them occupied, and a long central aisle that he walked her down without speaking. At the far end, separated from the others by a makeshift partition of wire and scrap lumber, was a large crate. Garrett stopped, looked at her, then looked at the crate. Emily followed his gaze. She was thinner than she should have been, lying on her side with the particular stillness of an animal that has learned to conserve everything. The gray muzzle was new. The scarring on her right flank was not. Emily had been there when Shadow got that scar, a fragment of debris in a cleared building that should have been clear. Both of them hit, Emily treating Shadow's wound while her own ears were still ringing. 7 years ago, which felt like someone else's life. The dark eyes opened when Emily crouched down, and something changed in them. Not recognition yet. Recognition takes a moment. Then Shadow's tail moved, once, like a question. Emily pressed her forehead against the wire of the crate door and didn't move for a long time. Behind her, Garrett was very quiet. She had a puppy, he finally said. About 6 weeks after she came to me, I almost lost them both. She was in rough shape. He paused. I kept them here because I didn't know where else to send them. The puppy's in with her, Small one. She never lets her out of reach. Emily pulled back from the crate and looked. There was a small bundle against Shadow's belly, dark-furred, ears still oversized for its head, watching Emily with enormous, uncertain eyes. She hadn't known. There was no way she could have known. "I need to get them both scanned," she said. Her voice was different. She couldn't fully control what it sounded like right now. "Shadow's chip. I need a record of where she's been. There's a death record filed with the Army that says she died 3 years ago. That record is fraudulent, and I need to prove it." Garrett's face had gone careful. "Fraudulent. Someone filed a false death report for a military working dog. That's a federal matter." She stood up. "If you'll let me take her to Dr. Osmond tonight, I can begin the documentation process. She'll be back in your care until I have somewhere safe to—" "You're her handler," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, then he went to the partition and started unlocking it. "Take them both," he said. "I've been waiting for someone to come for that dog for over a year. I've got 12 other animals to look after, and she never fit here. She's been waiting too. You can see it in her." Emily opened the crate door. Shadow didn't rush out. She got to her feet slowly, in the way of animals that have learned not to move too fast, and stepped forward and put her nose against Emily's hand. Emily held still and let her take her time. The puppy tumbled out after her, tripped over her own feet, and landed against Emily's boot. Well, Dr. Osmond ran the scan that night, after hours, the clinic lit by overhead fluorescence, and the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided this mattered enough to stay late. The chip read clean. The number matched Emily's records exactly. "She's alive," Dr. Osmond said, which was obvious but seemed to need saying, "and she's registered as deceased in the military system." "Which means someone with access to that system changed the record," Emily said. "Or someone with money paid someone who did." Dr. Osmond printed the scan results and handed them across. "What do you do with this?" "I start with the Army." Emily folded the paper. "And if they don't move fast enough, I go above them." She looked at Shadow, who was sitting at her left side, not at heel exactly because they hadn't reestablished that yet, but close. As close as she could get. The puppy was asleep under the exam table, curled into a black comma. "The record says cardiac failure," Emily said. "She was 4. What's the actual health picture?" "She's malnourished, some chronic inflammation in her joints consistent with poor conditions over an extended period, and she has what looks like old soft tissue damage in the left shoulder that wasn't treated properly when it happened." Dr. Osmond's voice had gone flat, the way professional voices go when they're containing something. "Whoever had her between the time she left your fiancé and the time she arrived here, I can only tell you the physical story. The rest of it, you're going to have to find yourself." Emily nodded. She was already building the sequence in her head. Marcus's reaction at the gate. Not grief, but fear. The timing of the death record. The fact that Shadow had been found as a stray, malnourished, in a city that wasn't anywhere near the neighborhood where Marcus lived. Someone had gotten rid of her, quietly, with paperwork, and the paperwork had been thorough enough to require access, either to the military record system directly or to someone who had it. "Someone erased her on purpose," Emily said quietly. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. She was just saying it out loud to hear what it sounded like. It sounded like the beginning of something. She gathered the scan results, the printed chip record, and the official death notice she'd been carrying for 10 days. She put them in the waterproof folder she'd bought at a drugstore 2 blocks from the Pinebrook Inn. She clipped Shadow's borrowed lead to the borrowed collar Garrett had sent with them, lifted the sleeping puppy in her other arm, and walked out of Dr. Osmond's clinic into the cold night air. At the corner, under a streetlight that actually worked, she stopped and looked down at the folder. Then she took out her phone and dialed a number from memory. A number she hadn't used in 5 years, belonging to a man she hadn't spoken to since before everything fell apart. It rang 4 times. "Voss," said the voice on the other end. "It's Carter," she said. "Emily Carter. I know it's been a while." A pause. "Carter." Something shifted in his voice. "You're back." "I'm back." She looked at Shadow, who was watching her the way working dogs watch their handlers, completely attentive, waiting. "I need to talk to someone in military criminal investigations. I have a fraudulent death record for a military working dog, And I have the dog in front of me, and I have reason to believe the paper trail goes somewhere ugly. Another pause. Longer this time. How fast do you need this? Yesterday would have been good. I'll make some calls tonight, Voss said. Where are you staying? She gave him the motel name. He repeated it back in the flat tone of a man who had spent decades not commenting on anyone else's accommodations. Stay close to your phone, he said. Always do, she said, and ended the call. She stood at the corner a moment longer, the puppy shifting in her arm, shadow pressed against her leg, the folder of evidence that was going to unravel something she hadn't seen the full shape of yet tucked under her elbow. The rain had stopped while she was inside. The streets were wet and empty, and the city looked like a city that had no idea what was coming for it. She started walking back toward the motel. 3 blocks behind her, a dark SUV sat with its engine off, lights off, parked at an angle that let the driver watch the entrance of Dr. Osman's clinic. The driver had been there for 40 minutes. He had a phone to his ear and was saying very little, just listening, and his knuckles, where they gripped the wheel with his other hand, were white. He waited until Emily's silhouette disappeared around a corner. Then he made a second call. She found the dog, he said. She's got documentation. Whatever came back from the other end of the line made him glance in his rearview mirror. I understand, he said. I'll handle it. He didn't sound like a man who believed that. The man in the SUV didn't follow her that night. Emily knew because she'd taken 3 unnecessary turns on the way back to the motel and watched her 6 the entire time. An old habit, one of the ones that had saved her life more than once, in places she didn't talk about. Nobody came around the corner after her. Nobody parked on the street outside the Pinebrook Inn that didn't belong there. Either the man in the SUV had decided to wait, or he'd decided she wasn't worth following yet. Neither option was comforting. She settled Shadow and the puppy in the room. Shadow on the floor at the foot of the bed, the puppy in a cardboard box lined with a motel towel, which the puppy immediately climbed out of and fell asleep against Shadow's back leg instead. Emily sat at the small desk with her folder open and her phone on the table beside her and started writing down everything in sequence, the way she'd been trained to document things. Dates, times, sources, exact wording. Not impressions. Facts. The death record was filed 31 months ago. The timestamp on the filing was 0217, which was the kind of hour when automated systems process paperwork and nobody is watching. The certifying official's name was listed as Colonel R. Harwick, 5th Support Command, which was the unit Emily had been attached to. She'd never met a Colonel Harwick. That didn't mean he didn't exist, but it was worth checking. She wrote it down. Shadow had been found as a stray by a civilian who'd brought her to Dr. Osman's clinic approximately 17 months after the death record was filed, which meant someone had held her for roughly 14 months before she ended up malnourished and wandering the east side of Redstone City. 14 months somewhere. Somewhere with conditions bad enough to leave the kind of marks Dr. Osman had cataloged without expression. She wrote that down too. Marcus had been Shadow's secondary welfare contact. That was standard procedure. When a handler deployed, someone stateside was designated to oversee the dog's care if anything happened. Emily had listed Marcus because she trusted him and because it was the practical choice. What the records didn't tell her was whether Marcus had actively transferred Shadow to someone or whether he'd simply stopped looking after her and let someone else step in. The distinction mattered. The distinction was the difference between a man who was negligent and a man who was complicit. She looked at what she'd written for a long time. Then she added one more line at the bottom. Who benefits from Shadow being dead on paper? She didn't have an answer yet, but she'd learned a long time ago that the right question was worth more than a premature answer. Voss called at 0647. His name was Dale Voss, and he'd been her unit's liaison officer for the last year before her capture. A lean, careful man in his mid-50s who communicated almost entirely in short sentences and trusted very few people. Emily had been one of them. She didn't know exactly why, but she'd never wasted it. I made contact with CID last night, he said. They want to talk to you. CID was the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. When? Today, if possible. There's an agent already in Redstone City. She's been there 2 weeks on something unrelated, and when I told her what you had, she said she'd clear her afternoon. Emily looked at the folder on the desk. What's her name? Agent Dana Rourke. She's solid. She's not going to brush you off. A pause. Emily, I have to ask, are you doing okay? I'm functional. That's not what I asked. She was quiet a moment. I found Shadow, she said. She's alive. She's in this room right now. He didn't say anything for a second. When he did, his voice was different, lower, something in it that she didn't often hear from Voss. Good. That's good, Carter. The death record is fraudulent. That's not an opinion. That's a documented fact. I need someone with authority to pull on the thread and find out how far it goes. Rourke can do that. I'll text you her number. She's expecting your call. He hung up without pleasantries, which was exactly what she'd expected and what she needed. Agent Dana Rourke turned out to be a compact woman in her early 40s who wore no jewelry, spoke in flat declarative sentences, and had the particular energy of someone who had been in uncomfortable situations for so long that discomfort had simply become her baseline. She met Emily at a diner on the west side called Harley's, which had good coffee and bad lighting and booths deep enough that the conversation stayed private. Rourke had looked at the folder for 11 minutes without speaking. Emily had timed it. When she looked up, her expression was the same as when she'd sat down. The certifying official on this record, she said, Colonel R. Harwick. I flagged it too. I served with 5th Support for 2 years before my capture. I don't have a memory of that name. Because he retired 14 years ago, Rourke said. He's 73 years old and lives in Tucson and has dementia severe enough that his daughter manages his affairs. His credentials were used without his knowledge. This is identity fraud inside the military record system, on top of the falsified death record. She closed the folder and looked at Emily the way she might look at a situation that had just expanded past its original perimeter. That requires either a very sophisticated outside actor or someone with current internal access. Or both, Emily said. Or both, Rourke agreed. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The dog's with you now? Yes. I'm going to need a full scan record, the chip documentation, and Dr. Osmond's clinical notes from both examinations, 14 months ago and last night. I have them. Rourke took the second folder Emily slid across the table. She opened it, scanned the top page. The shoulder injury, the chronic inflammation. This is consistent with an animal kept in poor conditions for an extended period. That's what Dr. Osmond said. It's also consistent with the kind of conditions you see in certain types of... She stopped, looked at something in the notes more closely. Then she looked up at Emily. Who was the secondary welfare contact for this dog? Emily had known this was coming. Marcus Webb, my former fiancé. He's remarried, lives in Redstone City. I went to see him 4 days ago. His reaction? Evasive. He confirmed the dog was dead, gave me no specific details, shifted weight when I pressed him on the timeline. He was scared of something. She paused. Not of me. Of whatever would happen if the wrong information came out. Rourke wrote something in her notepad. I'll need to speak with him. I figured, I'll also need you to not speak with him again before I do. Emily looked at her. I know, Rourke said, but you're not an investigator, and if he lawyers up before I get to him, we lose leverage. What he knows right now, he doesn't know we know. That gap is useful. Understood. Last question. Rourke set down her pen. Is there anything in your own history with this man, the relationship, the circumstances before you deployed, that he could use to complicate your credibility? Emily thought about that with more honesty than the question probably required. We were engaged for 4 years. I deployed, I was captured, he waited 2 years, and then moved on. That's not a complication. That's just what happened. I don't have any grievances on record. I'm not pursuing anything personal. That's not what I mean, Rourke said. I mean, is there anything that would make your report look like it comes from a place of personal motivation rather than factual documentation? The documentation stands on its own. It does, Rourke agreed. I'm just making sure you know that he or his attorneys will try to reframe it. They always do. Emily picked up her coffee. It had gone lukewarm. Let them try, she said. The call came from Marcus 2 days later. She almost didn't pick up. She'd given Rourke her word about not initiating contact, but the instruction hadn't technically covered incoming calls, and she answered on the fourth ring with a calculation that it was better to know what he wanted than to let him stew. "Emily." He sounded like a man who hadn't been sleeping. "I need to talk to you. Agent Rourke from CID should have been in contact with you by now." A pause that told her Rourke had, in fact, been in contact. "Yes, that's why I'm calling." "Then you should talk to your attorney and talk to Rourke." "Emily, listen." His voice cracked slightly at the edge, not performance. She'd known him long enough to know the difference between Marcus performing emotion and Marcus actually feeling it, and what she was hearing was the second thing. "I didn't know what he was going to do with her. I swear to you, he said he was going to find her a home. He said it was better than a shelter, that he had contacts." "Who?" Emily said. Her voice was very quiet. "I can't." "Marcus." "Who did you give her to?" A long silence. She could hear him breathing, could hear something else in the background. A television, maybe, or someone in another room. "He told me you were dead," Marcus said. "That's what they told us. MIA, presumed dead, 18 months in. I couldn't keep the dog. I wasn't equipped for it. She needed a handler, not just an owner, and she was getting destructive because she wasn't working, and I didn't know what to do with her. He came to me. He said he could place her." His name. Darren Holst. The name came out like he'd been holding it underwater and finally let it surface. "He runs a property management company out of the business district. But that's not all he does. I found out later after Diane and I were all ready." He stopped. "He has operations. Things he keeps quiet. I only found out pieces of it, and I tried to stay away from it because I didn't want to know the rest. And then you showed up at the gate, and I knew you were going to find her, and I knew what it was going to lead back to, and I just—" "Did you file the death record?" Emily asked. No, I didn't even know there was a death record until the agent told me. Holst must have done that, or someone he paid." Emily stood very still in the middle of the motel room, watching Shadow watch her from the floor. "You're going to tell all of this to Agent Rourke," she said. "Everything you just told me, his name, how he approached you, what you know about his operations, everything. He's connected, Emily. He knows people in this city. I don't care who he knows. You're going to tell Rourke, and you're going to tell her today." Another silence. Then, very quietly, "I'm sorry about everything. I know that doesn't—" "Call Rourke," Emily said, and hung up. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Shadow got up and came to her without being called, and pressed her head against Emily's knee with the particular deliberateness of a dog who had been trained to read people and had never stopped doing it even when the training wasn't relevant anymore. Emily put her hand on Shadow's head and sat there for a minute, just breathing, and then she got out her notepad and wrote down the name. Darren Holst. Swots. Rourke moved fast after Marcus came in. She didn't share everything with Emily. She was an investigator, not a partner, and Emily understood that distinction and respected it. But she shared enough to keep the picture coherent, because Emily had been the one to crack the case open, and Rourke was not the kind of agent who forgot that. Darren Holst was 48 years old, owner of Holst Property Group, which had offices in the business district of Redstone City and a satellite presence in 2 other cities. On paper, he was prosperous, civic-minded, twice quoted in local business journals about economic development and commercial real estate trends. His LinkedIn profile had over 3,000 connections. He donated to the mayor's re-election campaign. What the business journals didn't cover was the secondary operation that Rourke's contact in the federal task force had been quietly building a file on for the past 11 months. Rourke wouldn't give Emily the specifics yet. The investigation was active, and she didn't want details circulated. But she gave Emily enough. "Breeding operation," Rourke said. They were standing in the parking lot of a grocery store because Rourke didn't want to be in a diner again. The wind was cold, and both of them were ignoring it. High volume, unlicensed, multiple locations. He sources dogs from various channels, and the legitimate front is a private placement service. He tells buyers he's connecting them with reputable breeders. The reality is, she paused, choosing words. The conditions at the actual facilities aren't what the buyers are told. Emily kept her face neutral. It took work. Shadow. Shadow fits. She's a Belgian Malinois from documented military stock, which in certain circles commands a significant premium. Someone with the right contacts could move a dog like her into a high-end breeding program and charge substantially for access. Rourke looked at her. I'm sorry. I know that's not easy to hear. How many facilities? That's what the task force is working on. They had a partial location list before your call came in. Your documentation, the false death record, the chip scan, the medical records. It adds a layer they didn't have. It connects the operation to military record fraud, which pulls in federal jurisdiction that they were having trouble establishing on animal cruelty statutes alone. Emily processed that. My documentation gives them the federal hook. Yes. Then use it. Rourke looked at her steadily. There's a compound, about 40 miles east of the city, off a rural highway. The task force believes that's the primary facility. They've been building probable cause for 3 months, and they're close, but close doesn't get a warrant. She let that sit there. What gets a warrant? Emily asked. A credible witness with documented evidence of a specific animal's illegal transfer, combined with a fraudulent military record that constitutes federal identity fraud. Rourke held her gaze. That's you, Carter. Emily understood what was being asked. You need me to make a formal statement. I need you to sit with a federal prosecutor tomorrow morning and give a full account of everything. The death record, the chip scan, Shadow's medical history, what Marcus Webb told you, the chain of custody from Webb to Holst. Everything. She paused. If you do that, the prosecutor believes we have sufficient grounds. The task force moves within 72 hours. Then I'll be there at whatever time you say. Rourke nodded once, the nod of someone who had expected that answer, but was still relieved to hear it. 8 a.m. I'll send you the address. She started to turn back toward her car, then stopped. One more thing. The man who was watching Dr. Osmond's clinic the night you retrieved Shadow. We identified him from the clinic's external camera. His name is Trevor Galt. He's a former private security contractor who does intermittent work for Holst Property Group. Emily absorbed that. So Holst already knows I have the documentation. He knows you have something. We don't think he knows yet how much. She looked at Emily with the directness of someone choosing to be honest because the alternative was more dangerous. Which means the next 72 hours are the window. After that, he may move assets or take other steps to make the picture harder to prove. After Rourke drove away, Emily stood in the parking lot for a moment longer. She thought about Shadow in the motel room, the puppy sleeping against her back, the way Shadow had looked at her that first night in Garrett Finch's machine shop, the question in her eyes before recognition settled in. An animal that had survived 14 months of conditions Emily didn't want to visualize, had come out the other side thin and damaged, and still protecting a puppy smaller than her own head. She thought about Darren Holst in his business district office, his LinkedIn profile, his mayor's campaign donation. She thought about Trevor Galt sitting in his dark SUV with his phone and his white knuckles. She walked back to her car, started the engine, and drove back toward the motel. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. She'd give them everything, every document, every date, every conversation, every observable fact in the order it had occurred. She was a combat nurse. She had spent years in conditions that required exact memory, exact documentation, exact communication under pressure. She knew how to tell a story so that the person listening had no choice but to act on it. Darren Holst had no idea what he'd done when he'd bought a dog from a grieving man and filed paperwork on her in the middle of the night. He'd created a record. And Emily Carter was very, very good at following records. The prosecutor's name was James Whitfield, and he was younger than Emily expected. Mid-30s, a little rumpled, with the deep-set eyes of someone who habitually stayed later than he should. He listened to her full statement without interrupting, which she appreciated, and asked follow-up questions in the crisp shorthand of a man who knew how to find the legally significant detail inside a longer account. At the end of 2 hours, he sat back in his chair, looked at his notes, and said, "How certain are you about the timeline Marcus Webb gave you?" He has no reason to protect the timeline. Holst is the person he's afraid of. Making the timeline cleaner makes his own culpability look worse. Whitfield made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite doubt. The death record. The certifying credentials stolen from a retired officer with dementia. He set his pen down. That alone is... He stopped himself. I'm going to be very direct with you, Ms. Carter. What you've brought us has closed a gap we've been trying to close for 3 months. I want you to understand that this doesn't happen without what you documented. I want it to be enough for the warrant, Emily said. It is. He picked his pen back up. I'll have the affidavit filed by noon. If the judge signs today, the task force moves tomorrow. Emily nodded. There is one thing. He looked at her carefully. Holst has a legal team on retainer that is considerable. They will look at every aspect of your documentation and your history and your conduct in this case, and they will look for anything that compromises your credibility as a witness. If there is anything, there isn't. I'm not suggesting there is. I'm asking you to be prepared for the attempt. He held her gaze. You were captured in a classified operation. Some of your service history is going to be difficult to verify publicly. Defense attorneys use that. They call it the gap. They try to suggest that unverifiable history is the same as disputed history. Emily looked at him evenly. My medical records from captivity will be submitted to the DOD if relevant. My unit commander at the time of my deployment can be contacted directly. Dr. Osmond's records are clean, Garrett Finch's records are clean, and the chip documentation is literally a federal database entry that no one on Holst's legal team can alter. She paused. They can try to complicate who I am. They can't change what I brought you. Whitfield studied her for a moment. Then he smiled, just briefly. The smile of someone who had been doing this long enough to recognize a person who wasn't going to be shaken. No, he said. They can't. She drove back to the motel to wait. The task force was moving tomorrow. 72 hours had compressed to 24. She had her documentation, Rourke had her statement, Whitfield had his warrant affidavit, and Marcus Webb had given a recorded account that corroborated her timeline at every point where their knowledge overlapped. Darren Holst was in his business district office, or his large house, or somewhere comfortable, and he did not yet know what was 40 miles east of the city at a rural compound was about to be walked into by people carrying federal authority and the exact evidence they needed. She was sitting on the floor of the motel room with Shadow's head in her lap and the puppy chewing thoughtfully on the lace of her left boot when her phone buzzed. Not Rourke, not Voss, not Whitfield. The number wasn't in her contacts, but she recognized the area code. Redstone City, local. She answered. Miss Carter. The voice was male, measured, the voice of a man who was used to being listened to. My name is Darren Holst. I think we should talk before this gets any further out of hand. Emily didn't move. Beside her, Shadow raised her head. I'm listening, Emily said. I understand you've been doing some investigative work. I understand you're angry, and I think your anger is completely understandable given the circumstances. His tone was warm, even, the tone of a man managing a situation. But I want to be very clear with you that the picture you have is incomplete, and some of the information you've been given is inaccurate. And if you proceed the way I understand you're planning to proceed, you are going to cause significant damage to people who don't deserve it. Such as? Marcus Webb is not a bad man. He made a decision under grief that he regrets. If you move forward, and this becomes a federal matter, he's going to be caught in the middle of something that will ruin his life, his wife, his business. He paused. I'm not asking you to drop anything. I'm asking you to have a conversation with me directly so that I can give you the full picture. She said nothing. I also want you to know, he continued, that the dog, Shadow, I believe you call her, she is being well cared for. Whatever you've been told about conditions, I have the dog, Emily said. A silence. Shorter than it should have been, which told her he'd already known that. Then you know she's in good condition. I have her veterinary records from last night and from 14 months ago, Emily said. I have her chip scan. I have her official death record, which was filed using credentials stolen from a retired officer who has dementia. I have a statement from Marcus Webb. She kept her voice completely level. I don't need the full picture, Mr. Holst. I have the picture I need. Another silence. Longer this time. When he spoke again, the warmth was still there, But something underneath it had changed. A texture in his voice that reminded her of the way a room feels the moment before something violent happens. Ms. Carter, I'd strongly encourage you to think carefully about what you're starting here. You've been through a great deal. You came back to a city that moved on without you. That's an incredibly difficult thing, and I have genuine sympathy for it. But a woman in your situation, limited resources, complicated history, no fixed address, he let that sit. I'd encourage you to consider whether this is a fight you can actually sustain. Emily looked at Shadow. Shadow looked back at her. Thank you for the call, Emily said. She ended it, put the phone face down on the floor, and sat very still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked the phone back up and called Rourke. Holst just called me directly, she said when Rourke picked up. He knows about the warrant request. The silence on Rourke's end had a different quality than Holst's silences had. It was the silence of someone recalibrating very fast. He has a source, Rourke said, either in the prosecutor's office or in the task force. He tried to intimidate me, subtly, but the structure was clear. Emily paused. Rourke, if he has a source in the task force, I know, Rourke's voice was tight. I know exactly what that means. He's going to move before the warrant goes through. Possibly. Which means, if there are dogs at that compound, Carter, Rourke's voice dropped, very deliberate. Listen to me carefully. Do not go to that compound. Do you understand me? Whatever you're thinking right now, the answer is no. Emily was quiet. Carter? I hear you, she said. She put the phone down. She looked at the address she'd written in the corner of her notepad 3 days ago. The rural highway, the compound 40 miles east, the address she'd gotten from a name buried in Dr. Osmond's contact records. A former client who'd once mentioned in passing that he'd seen dogs at a property out east, more dogs than made any kind of normal sense. She hadn't told Rourke about that address. She'd been waiting to see if she needed it. She looked at Shadow. Shadow had her ears forward, watching Emily's face with the complete attention of a dog who had worked alongside a human long enough to know what a decision looked like. Outside the motel window, a truck pulled into the lot and sat with its engine running. Emily got up slowly and moved to the edge of the window without touching the curtain and looked out through the gap at the edge. The truck had no plates. The truck sat for 4 minutes without anyone getting out. Emily counted. She stood at the edge of the window with 2 inches of visibility through the curtain gap, her breathing controlled and shallow, and she counted. 4 minutes was too long for someone lost or looking for a room number. 4 minutes was surveillance or intimidation, or both. Shadow had moved to her left side without being told. The dog's shoulder was pressed against Emily's leg, and her ears were forward, and her body was the particular kind of still that wasn't relaxed, it was coiled. Whatever had happened to Shadow in the years between Marcus's doorstep and Garrett Finch's machine shop, she hadn't lost that. Some things go deep enough that nothing can reach them. On the floor behind them, the puppy was still chewing the bootlace. Emily moved back from the window, picked up her jacket, and put it on. She checked her phone. No call back from Rourke yet, which meant Rourke was either on another call or already moving pieces she couldn't see. She didn't wait. She clipped Shadow's lead, tucked the puppy into the inside of her jacket with the dog's small, warm weight against her ribs, and went out the back. The motel had a service exit through the laundry room that led to an alley running parallel to the main lot. She'd identified it on day 1, the way she identified exits in every space she occupied, and she moved through it now without hurrying, because hurrying draws attention, and attention was what she didn't need. She came out on the cross street, turned east, and walked 3 blocks to a gas station where she'd noticed a payphone 2 days earlier, an actual payphone, one of the last ones, mounted on the exterior wall next to the air pump. She used it to call Rourke's cell. Rourke answered on 2 rings. "Where are you?" "Gas station, 3 blocks from the motel. There was a vehicle outside with no plates. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted." "Smart." A sound of movement on Rourke's end, something shifting fast. "Holst is accelerating. I just got confirmation from the task force. A contact of theirs in county records flagged an unusual property transfer filed this morning. The compound address, 40 miles east. It was just moved into a shell LLC. Emily understood what that meant. He was building distance between himself and the asset. When federal agents arrived at the compound, the paper trail to Holst would be one layer removed, not invisible, but murkier. It was the move of a man who knew something was coming and was trying to reduce his surface area. "How long until the warrant?" Emily asked. "Whitfield is pushing the judge. He thinks end of day. Could be tonight." "That's not fast enough if he's already moving assets." "I know that, Carter. Rourke!" She kept her voice down, a habit from years of conversations that needed to stay between two people. "I have an address for the compound. I got it independently. Not from the task force, not from your investigation. A former client of Dr. Osmond's mentioned it in passing weeks before any of this started, and I found it in her contact notes when she let me look through records relevant to Shadow's intake." Silence on Rourke's end. Then, "You're telling me this now?" "I'm telling you this now because Holst just called me personally, which means he has a source somewhere close to your chain of command, and I didn't want the address in any system that source could access before the warrant was signed." Another silence. Rourke's silences had texture. This one had the particular density of someone recalculating trust in real time and coming out on the right side of it. "Send it to me directly, my personal cell, not the task force channel." "Sending now." She texted it from her own phone and waited. "Got it," Rourke said. "Stay where you are. Do not go east. I mean that." "I heard you the first time." "You heard me. That's different from meaning it." Rourke paused. "There's a federal safe house location I'm going to text you. Take the dogs there and stay put. One of our people will be there within the hour." Emily looked down at Shadow, who was sitting at her feet watching the street with the methodical attention of an animal that had never fully stood down. "Rourke, if he's moving assets, that includes the animals. If they clear that compound before the warrant, I know. Those dogs can't be moved again. Some of them probably won't survive another move." "Carter." Rourke's voice was sharp and quiet at once, the voice of someone saying stop without wanting to say it out loud. "I know. We are working it. Go to the safe house." Emily ended the call. She stood at the gas station wall with the puppy warm against her ribs and Shadow at her side, and looked east down the long, flat road that eventually became the highway, that eventually became the turnoff for a rural compound 40 miles away. The morning was gray and still. A semi rolled past on the main road, and the wind it made moved through her jacket. She went to the safe house. The safe house was a rented house in a quiet residential neighborhood, 3 bedrooms and a detached garage, and a fence around the yard that gave Shadow room to move. The agent who met her there was young, late 20s, crew cut, introduced himself as Farrell, and didn't volunteer anything else. He set up a laptop on the kitchen table and monitored something on a secure channel and didn't talk to her except to ask if she needed water. She didn't need water, she needed the warrant to go through. It went through at 4:17 in the afternoon. She knew because Rourke called her the moment it cleared. "We're moving," Rourke said. "Task force plus 2 federal marshals plus a specialized animal welfare unit out of the state AG's office. Estimated arrival at the compound in 60 minutes. I want to be there." "You're not cleared. I'm the key witness, and I'm the handler for the primary animal whose documentation built this case," Emily said. "If there are animals at that compound in acute distress, you need someone with medical training on site. The animal welfare unit has protocols, but they don't have field medical. I do." A pause. Rourke was thinking, not refusing. There was a difference. "You ride with our vehicle," Rourke said. "You stay behind the perimeter until the site is declared secure. You do not engage with any individual at that location. You follow every instruction immediately. If I tell you to get behind something, you get behind it. Understood?" "I mean it, Carter. The moment you stop being an asset and start being a liability, I pull you back. I've operated in worse conditions than this. I know you have. That's part of what worries me." The convoy was 4 vehicles, 2 task force SUVs, 1 federal marshal vehicle, and a white van from the animal welfare unit. Emily rode in the second task force vehicle next to an agent named Delaney, who said approximately 4 words the entire drive and spent the rest of the time checking his sidearm and watching the road. Shadow was in the back cargo area on a blanket. The puppy was at the safe house with Farrell, who'd looked at her with the expression of a man who had not signed up for puppy duty but was adjusting. The compound was visible from the highway turnoff, a cluster of low metal buildings behind a chain-link fence topped with wire, set back from the road on flat scrubland with nothing around it for a quarter mile in any direction. One access road. A truck parked inside the fence line. No visible movement from the road, but Emily could see cameras on the fence posts. Rourke's voice came over the vehicle radio. "They have visual of the convoy. We go now, before they start anything they'll regret." The vehicles accelerated. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not the clean, decisive sequence that gets described in briefings. Emily had been in enough real situations to know the difference between how things are supposed to go and how they actually go, and this went the way real things go, fast and loud and slightly wrong in 3 separate places at once. The gate was locked, which they'd expected. The bolt cutters dealt with it in under 30 seconds. What they hadn't expected was the second vehicle parked behind the main building, engine running, which Delaney spotted at the same moment it started moving, not toward the gate, but toward the far fence line, where the chain link was older and thinner. "Vehicle fleeing east," Delaney said into the radio, already pushing open his door. "Requesting intercept." The third SUV broke from the convoy line to cut it off. Emily stayed in the vehicle the way she'd been told, watching through the windshield as the task force agents moved into the compound in the practiced pattern of people who did this for a living. She kept track of where each of them was without meaning to, a habit left over from coordinating casualty response in active environments. Shadow was up in the cargo area, nose to the window. The fleeing vehicle didn't make it to the fence. The third SUV caught it at an angle and forced it to a stop on the scrubland, and 2 agents had the driver out and face down before Emily could see clearly who it was. Rourke's voice on the radio. "Site partially cleared. We have approximately—" A pause, something happening off mic. "We have a significant number of animals, requesting medical support inside the perimeter." Emily was out of the vehicle before Rourke finished the sentence. The smell hit her first, ammonia and damp, and something organic underneath that she recognized from field medicine. The smell of animals in poor condition, the particular weight of it that sits in the back of the throat. She'd treated human casualties in environments with this smell layered over everything else, and her body responded to it before her mind caught up, stepping into a mode she hadn't needed in 5 years but hadn't lost. The main building was a long metal structure divided into sections by wire partitions. The animal welfare unit's 2 specialists were already inside, moving between sections, and Emily came in behind them and started doing what she was trained to do. Systematic rapid assessment. Not emotional. Practical first, emotional later, because if you let the second thing happen before the first thing is finished, you stop being useful. There were 23 dogs. She counted as she moved. Various breeds, various sizes, various conditions. Some of them were in reasonable shape, thin but mobile, no acute injuries visible. Others were not. A male Rottweiler in the third section was down on his side and not responding to sound. Emily crouched beside him, checked his gums, pale, capillary refill slow, checked his breathing, found it shallow and irregular. "This one needs IV fluids and thermal support now," she said to the nearest welfare specialist, a woman with short gray hair and the efficient hands of someone who knew what she was looking at. "He's in early shock. If he's been like this more than a few hours—" "We have equipment in the van," the woman said. "I'm Kessler. What's your training?" "Combat nurse, Army. 5 years emergency and trauma and field conditions." Kessler looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then, "Come with me." They worked for the next hour in the kind of focused silence that happens when people who know what they're doing get to just do it. The Rottweiler came back, slowly, a degree at a time, his color improving once the fluids were running, and they had a thermal blanket under him. 2 other dogs needed immediate attention. One had an infection in her foreleg that had gone untreated long enough to be concerning, but not long enough to be irreversible. One was so dehydrated his skin stayed tented when Kessler pinched it. Emily moved between them without stopping, because stopping meant thinking about the space around her. The cramped sections, the wire, the smell. And she didn't have room for that right now. Outside, she could hear the agents working, voices, equipment, the sound of the fleeing vehicle's driver being formally arrested. At one point, she heard Rourke on the radio saying Holst's name in a tone that meant something was happening somewhere else, something that wasn't the compound. She filed it and kept working. It was Shadow who found the last section. She'd been off lead since Emily came inside. Rourke hadn't commented on it, and Emily had made the call without overthinking it, because Shadow was a trained working dog, and she was useful. She'd moved through the building with the quiet, systematic attention of a dog doing what she was built to do. And now she stopped at a door in the back wall that looked like a supply closet and pressed her nose to the gap at the bottom and stood very still. Emily crossed to her. The door was padlocked. She found Delaney 3 sections over and told him, and he came back with bolt cutters from his kit without asking questions. And when the padlock came off and the door swung open, Emily understood why it had been separate from the rest. Inside were 6 animals in individual crates, 3 Belgian Malinois, 1 German Shepherd, 1 Dutch Shepherd, 1 mixed breed that showed all the physical markers of working dog lineage, all of them with identification tattooed in their ears. Military tattoos, the kind that shouldn't be on any animal that wasn't either still active or formally and legitimately retired. Emily stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and photographed every tattoo in sequence, methodical and thorough, because this was evidence and evidence had to be handled right. "Rourke," she called. Rourke appeared at the end of the building. She walked over, looked past Emily into the room, and was quiet for several seconds. "Military working dogs," Emily said. 6. All tattooed. All, based on what I can see, in conditions consistent with what Shadow presented when she was found. Rourke looked at the photographs on Emily's phone. Then she got on her radio. "I need the CID liaison on scene immediately," she said. "And somebody get Whitfield on the phone. We have a material expansion of the original warrant scope." She looked at Emily. "This just got bigger." "I know. Holst's lawyers are already at his office. They moved the moment the warrant cleared. Are they going to slow it down?" "They're going to try." Rourke's jaw was tight. "But documentation like this," she gestured at the room, at the tattooed animals, at the 6 crates. "This isn't a gray area. This is federal property. Stolen federal property kept in documented substandard conditions." She looked at Emily directly. "They're going to try to make this about you, your history, your credibility, your personal connection to Shadow. They're going to argue that your testimony is compromised by personal motivation. You told me that already. I'm telling you again because it's starting. Holst's lead attorney put out a statement 2 hours ago. I just got a copy." She handed Emily her phone. The statement was 3 paragraphs. Emily read it once. It referred to her by name, described her as a former POW with unverified claims and demonstrated personal grievance, and suggested that the investigation had been initiated based on the uncorroborated account of an individual with significant psychological trauma history and financial motive. Emily handed the phone back. "They're going to pull your medical records from after repatriation," Rourke said. "The psychological evaluations. They'll try to argue that your perceptions and testimony are compromised," Emily finished. "I know." She looked at the room full of military dogs that shouldn't exist on any civilian property. She looked at Shadow, who had come to stand beside her and was looking at the 6 crates with an attention that was not curiosity. It was recognition. One working dog recognizing another. The particular stillness of an animal that understood, in whatever way animals understand things, that something here mattered. "The psychological evaluations from my repatriation will show that I am cognitively intact, emotionally functional, and fully capable of providing reliable testimony," Emily said. "They'll show I meet every standard for credible witness status, because I do." She paused. "But if Holst's attorneys are already running that play, they're scared. You run that play when the evidence against you is solid enough that attacking the witness is your only option." Rourke looked at her for a moment. Then she almost smiled. "You're not wrong." A sound from outside. A car door, voices, the specific cadence of an arrival that had weight behind it. Rourke turned toward the building entrance. Through the open door, Emily could see 2 black vehicles she hadn't seen before, and men in different gear than the task force. Not tactical, but authoritative. Military bearing, civilian clothes that didn't quite cover it. "That would be the CID liaison," Rourke said. "And She squinted. That's not just CID. The man who walked through the door first was in his early 60s, silver-haired, wearing a dark jacket over a dress shirt, and he walked through the building the way people walk through spaces they have jurisdiction over. Behind him were two uniformed army officers and a woman in a federal prosecutor's ID badge that Emily didn't recognize. He saw Rourke first, then tracked to Emily and stopped. "Carter," he said. Not a greeting. An identification. Emily didn't know his face, but she recognized the insignia on the collar of the officer directly behind him. "You're not just CID," Emily said. "No," he said. "I'm not." He looked at the room behind her, at the dogs, at the tattoos. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "My name is Brigadier General Warren Falk, and what you've just shown me in that room—" He stopped, looked at her with the directness of a senior officer who had decided to dispense with the conversational runway. 6 military working dogs, active-duty tattoo numbers. On a civilian property, in these conditions, connected to a fraudulent death record built on stolen credentials from a retired officer. "Yes, sir," Emily said. The form of address came out automatically, the way old muscle memory does. "How many did you say were here total?" 23 animals on site, 6 with military tattoos." He turned to the officer behind him. "I want ID verification on all 6 tattoos within the hour. Cross-reference against the missing and deceased records from the past 5 years." He turned back. "The fraudulent record used to declare your dog deceased. When I was briefed on this 2 hours ago, the initial read was one isolated incident. What I'm looking at right now is not one isolated incident." "No, sir," Emily said. "I don't think it ever was." Falk looked at her steadily. "Your documentation is what opened this. Rourke's briefing this morning was thorough, but the foundation of it was yours." He paused. "I also read your service record last night, after the initial brief." Emily said nothing. 5 years in enemy captivity, repatriated with full cognitive function, completed medical clearance in 11 weeks, which is— He stopped. "You're aware that's unusual." "I had reasons to get through it fast," she said. "Apparently." He looked at her in the way of a man reassessing something. "Holst's attorneys have submitted a formal motion to have your witness statement suppressed on credibility grounds. They filed it 40 minutes ago." He said it flatly, the way you report a weather condition. "Here it is, deal with it." "They're arguing psychological unreliability." "I know." "That motion is going to fail," he said, "because the evidence you provided is independently verifiable at every single point. The chip scan, the medical records, the fraudulent credentials, Marcus Webb's corroboration. None of that depends on your psychological history being uncomplicated." He paused. "I want you to hear that from someone with the rank to mean it." Outside, one of the uniformed officers was photographing the tattoos on the 6 dogs, calling numbers into a radio. Emily's phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, and it was 4 words. "He's not here anymore." She looked at it for a second, then she showed it to Rourke, who looked at it, and then both of them looked at Falk. "Holst," Rourke said. "His office confirmed he was in a meeting until 30 minutes ago. His attorneys are there. He's not." Falk's expression didn't change, but his posture did. A small, controlled shift that Emily recognized from years of watching senior officers receive information they'd been hoping not to receive. "Get his vehicle description and personal cell to local PD and highway patrol," he said. "Now." Rourke was already on her radio. Emily stood in the doorway of the back room with shadow pressed against her leg and 23 animals behind her that shouldn't be where they were, and she looked at the 4-word message on her phone screen and she thought about a man who had called her that morning from a position of apparent confidence and was now, apparently, running. Running meant the compound hadn't been enough to contain it. Running meant he knew the walls were coming down and he'd decided to get ahead of them. Running also meant he hadn't looked at what he was leaving behind. The room, the tattoos, the animals, the documentation trail that Emily had been building for 10 days, with the patience of someone who had spent 5 years learning that survival is just consistent action under pressure, repeated until the situation changes. She put the phone in her pocket. "He won't get far," she said, mostly to herself. But Shadow heard her, and the dog pressed her head briefly against Emily's hand, and then stood up straight again and looked at the door, and looked back, and waited. The way a working dog waits when she knows the job isn't finished, but she trusts the person beside her to know what comes next. Outside, the radios were all going at once. They found Holst's car at a regional airstrip 22 miles north of the city. Not a commercial airport, a private strip, the kind that catered to small charter operations and wealthy men who preferred not to wait in lines. The car was a silver Mercedes, parked badly at the edge of the tarmac with the driver's door still open, which told the highway patrol officer who found it that the departure had been unplanned in some crucial way. The keys were still in the ignition. A phone was on the passenger seat, and the phone had 11 missed calls from a number registered to Holst Property Group's primary legal account. Rourke got the report at the same time as Emily, because Emily was standing next to her when the call came in and Rourke had stopped bothering to step away. He had a charter arranged, Rourke said, mostly to herself. Or he thought he did. Did anything take off in the last 2 hours? Emily asked. One aircraft, 40 minutes ago. Single engine, filed a flight plan to a private field in, Rourke listened to her radio, New Mexico. She looked at Emily. He's on it. Then you know where he's landing. We know where he filed to land. That's not always the same thing. She was already dialing. The FAA and U.S. Marshals are going to have a very busy afternoon. Emily left her to it and walked back inside the main building, where Kessler and her assistant were finishing their triage documentation. The Rottweiler, who'd gone into early shock, was stable now, alert enough to track movement with his eyes, and Emily crouched beside his crate and checked his color one more time. Pink, refill under 2 seconds, breathing unlabored, and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She'd worked on human casualties in the field who didn't come back the way this dog had come back in the last 2 hours. Sometimes it went well. Sometimes you did everything right, and it still didn't go well, and you carried that and you kept moving. The going well part never stopped meaning something. You've done this before, Kessler said from behind her. Not a question. Different context. Same skills. Kessler was writing on a clipboard, not looking at her. The dehydrated shepherd in Section 2. You caught the tent test result before I did. I've been doing this for 16 years. Emily didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't offer one. Where'd you serve? Kessler asked. Mostly places that weren't on public maps. Kessler made a sound that was probably as close to a laugh as she got on active sites. I was Army Reserve, long time ago. Combat Support Hospital, Fort Drum. 2 deployments. She capped her pen and looked at Emily. You know what I noticed in the first 5 minutes you were in here? What? You never stopped moving. Some people come into a site like this and they freeze. Not from fear, just from the weight of it. You didn't do that. Emily stood up from the crate. You freeze, animals die. That's right. Kessler nodded at the building around them, with its 23 animals and its wire partitions and its smell. These animals need about 72 hours of intake care before they're stable enough for placement assessment. The 6 with military tattoos will be transferred to a DOD-designated veterinary facility pending CID confirmation of their identities. She paused. But the others, the ones who came through regular commercial channels, the ones Holst sourced from wherever he sourced them, those are going to need something, people who know what they're looking at. Emily understood what she was offering, but not quite saying. I'm a witness in a federal case. I don't know what my next few weeks look like. No, Kessler said, but I'm going to give you my card, and whenever you know, you call me. Falk spent the afternoon on his phone at the far end of the building, and the conversations he was having were above Emily's clearance, and she knew it and didn't try to get close. What she could observe was the pace of them, short, decisive, no long explanations, and the effect they seemed to have on the 2 uniformed officers who came and went with information. Things were moving somewhere above the visible line of the case, in the layer where rank and institutional authority did the work that field evidence had made possible. The tattoo verification came back at 1748. 5 of the 6 dogs in the back room matched records in the military working dog registry. Not deceased records, missing records. Animals listed as lost in transit or unaccounted for following handler incidents or simply marked with the bureaucratic ambiguity of status unknown. The sixth dog's tattoo number had been partially obscured, possibly deliberately, and the verification was still pending. Falk read the report, folded the paper, and walked over to Emily. 5 confirmed, he said. Over a period of 4 years, 5 military working dogs were diverted from legitimate end-of-service channels and ended up in a civilian breeding operation connected to Darren Holst. He looked at her with the directness she'd come to expect from him. Your dog was the 6th, and your dog is the one with a fraudulent death record, which means someone with internal military access was involved at least once. And once we establish the pattern, the probability is they were involved more than once. Emily absorbed that. The CID investigation is going to expand. Significantly. He tucked the folded paper into his jacket. I want to be transparent with you, because you're the reason we're standing here. This is going to take time. The full scope of it, tracing every animal, identifying every point of internal access, building the prosecution's case against every individual involved. That's months of work. The case against Holst is the most immediate, and that case is strong, but it's one layer. I understand that. What I don't want you to understand is that the time it takes means the rest of it doesn't matter to us. It does. He held her gaze. These were federal assets. Military working dogs are... He stopped, choosing his words with the care of a man who meant them. They're not equipment, regardless of how they get classified on paper. The individuals responsible for diverting them will be identified and they will face charges. That is not a courtesy statement. That is a commitment. Emily nodded once. Falk looked like he might say something else. Then he didn't, and walked back to his phone. Holst's chartered plane landed at a private field outside Gallup, New Mexico at 6:22 p.m., and the 2 U.S. Marshals who were waiting on the tarmac had their timing right. He was in zip ties before he got to the fence line. Rourke told Emily this at 7:04 in the parking area outside the compound, where Emily had finally sat down on the bumper of the animal welfare van because her legs had been carrying her for 12 hours, and it was time to stop pretending they didn't have opinions about that. His attorney tried to argue that the airstrip was a prearranged business trip, Rourke said. The marshals pointed out that business trips generally don't involve leaving your car door open on a tarmac. She sat down on the bumper beside Emily, which was slightly out of character for Rourke, and Emily appreciated it. He's being transported back tonight. Federal holding, no bail recommendation from Whitfield pending arraignment. What are the charges? Rourke exhaled slowly. Right now, federal fraud, specifically the misuse of military identification credentials to file a false official record, unlawful possession of federal property, that being the military working dogs, interstate transport of animals for unlicensed commercial breeding, which is a federal offense under the Animal Welfare Act. And, she paused, the driver of the vehicle that tried to breach the fence. His name is Roy Nasser. He talked almost immediately. He's been working for Holst for 6 years. He gave us 3 additional property addresses connected to the operation, one of which is outside Redstone City, and 2 of which are out of state. Emily looked at her. 3 more. We're coordinating with field offices in those jurisdictions tonight, which means the 23 animals here are not the total picture. The total picture was something Emily had suspected since the back room, since the 5 tattoo verifications, since the pattern had begun to show its actual size. She'd been tracking it in the methodical part of her mind while her hands were doing the medical work, the way she'd learned to track tactical situations in the field, maintaining the larger map even when you're focused on the immediate grid square. How many total animals are we talking about? She asked. Too early to say. Nasser's estimate was... Rourke stopped, like she was deciding how much to front-load. He said upward of 80 animals across all sites. He didn't know exact numbers. Emily looked at the scrubland. The light was going, the flat terrain turning gray in the early evening, and the compound behind her was lit by work lights that the task force had brought in on stands. It looked different in artificial light, more clinical, more like what it was. 80 animals, she said. At minimum. She said nothing else about it. There wasn't much to say about it that would be useful. The number was the number, and the response to it was already in motion, and the appropriate thing was to let it be in motion and not run over it by saying what it made her feel. Shadow, who had been lying at her feet for the last 20 minutes, lifted her head and rested her chin on Emily's knee. Emily put her hand on the dog's back. His attorneys are still pursuing the witness suppression motion, Rourke said, but Whitfield said the judge looked at it for about 8 minutes before setting it aside pending review, which in federal case terms is the equivalent of throwing it in a drawer. She paused. The psychological history argument, it's not going to work. Your repatriation evaluation records were pulled this afternoon by our office and reviewed by a DOD-cleared clinical consultant. His assessment is that your records demonstrate exceptional cognitive resilience under sustained adversity and that there is no clinical basis for questioning your testimonial reliability. Good, Emily said. He also said, and I'm quoting because it's notable, "This is one of the most coherent and well-documented witness accounts I've reviewed in 12 years of consulting." He said that before he knew anything about your background. He just read the documentation. Emily didn't respond to that. She was thinking about Whitfield's expression the morning she'd laid out the folder in his office, the way his pen had slowed and then stopped, the particular stillness of someone watching a case click into place. Holst's statement to the marshals was that he acted in good faith acquiring animals from third-party sources, Rourke continued, that he had no knowledge of the military origin of the dogs in the back room, that the death record was, quote, "not something I had any involvement with, and I'd like to understand where that claim originates." "He told me on the phone that Shadow was well cared for," Emily said, "by name. He used her name." Rourke looked at her. He said, "The dog, Shadow, I believe you call her, she is being well cared for." He'd been briefed on exactly which dog was mine and what I called her. A man with no knowledge of the military dogs at his compound wouldn't have been briefed on my dog's name. Rourke pulled out her notepad. "Say that again slowly." Emily repeated it word for word. She had the conversation memorized. She'd been composing it into a statement format since the moment she'd ended the call, because she'd known even then that what he said would matter later. "That's going to come up at arraignment," Rourke said, writing. "That's actual knowledge, not constructive knowledge. That's him telling you he knows what's at his facility." "I know," Emily said. Rourke finished writing and looked at her. Something shifted in Rourke's expression. Not warmth exactly, because Rourke wasn't built for warmth as a default, but something adjacent to respect that had moved past professional and into something more considered. "You've been running this like an investigation since day one," she said. "I've been running it like a recovery mission," Emily said. "The investigation part was just what the mission required." Marcus Webb came to the federal building the next morning voluntarily, with an attorney but without apparent resistance. Emily knew because she was there, not in the room, but in the adjacent waiting area, because Whitfield had asked her to remain available in case the meeting produced questions that needed her documentation as reference. She didn't see Marcus. She heard him once, through a wall, his voice. Not the words, just the rhythm of it. The cadence of someone who was telling a long story and stopping at certain points and starting again. He was in there for 2 hours and 40 minutes. When Whitfield came out, he looked at Emily and said, "He gave us Holst's accountant." Emily waited. The accountant managed the financial structure of the breeding operation through a series of LLCs that Holst Property Group maintained for investment purposes. Webb wasn't involved in the financial side, but he overheard a conversation 3 years ago at an event at Holst's house between Holst and the accountant. He remembered the accountant's name because it was unusual. Whitfield sat down across from her. "The accountant's name is Paul Wren. He's been with Holst for 11 years. And this morning, before we even called him, Paul Wren's attorney contacted our office." "He's talking," Emily said. "He's talking," Whitfield confirmed. "He's been talking since 7 this morning, apparently. He was in the dark about the military dogs. His account is consistent with what we'd expect if Holst kept that layer firewalled from the financial side. But he has 11 years of financial documentation, complete records of the LLCs, the revenue streams, the buyer accounts, every transaction." He looked at her steadily. "The breeding operation generated over $4 million in the past 6 years. Emily sat with that number for a moment. Not because it surprised her. She'd worked out early that the economics of what Holst was doing made the scale inevitable, but because numbers had a way of making things real in a different register. $4 million. Shadow had been a line item in a $4 million operation. How solid is Wren's documentation? She asked. Complete. Digital and physical copies. He kept everything. Whitfield almost smiled, the brief, controlled expression of a prosecutor who knew what complete financial documentation meant for a case. Holst's attorneys are aware that Wren is cooperating. They've been aware since 9 this morning, when Wren's attorney notified them, as a courtesy. He paused. Holst asked to speak to his lead attorney for 3 hours this morning and has said nothing since. He's deciding, Emily said. He's deciding, and his attorneys are looking at what Wren has and doing the arithmetic. Whitfield leaned forward slightly. Here's what I need from you. Holst's team is going to attempt to reach a plea arrangement that limits his exposure on the federal fraud charges. Specifically, they'll try to argue that the military record falsification was an isolated act conducted by a single employee without his direct authorization. What they can't argue around is the phone call he made to you. Emily reached into her folder and produced her phone's call log, which she'd screenshotted and printed the evening before. Incoming call, his number, logged at 9:47 a.m., duration 11 minutes and 32 seconds. I have a written account of the content of the call composed immediately after it ended. Whitfield took both documents. You wrote it down right after? Yes. Before you knew how significant it would be? I wrote it down because that's what you do with information that might matter, Emily said. You don't wait to find out if it matters. You document it when you have it. Whitfield looked at her. Ms. Carter, I've been a federal prosecutor for 14 years. I've worked with witnesses from military backgrounds, law enforcement backgrounds, intelligence backgrounds. I don't think I've encountered documentation this clean and this complete from a civilian witness with no formal investigative training. He set the papers down. I want you to understand something. Holst's attorneys called you, publicly, in their press statement, psychologically unreliable. A grievance-driven former POW with compromised judgment. His voice was flat and precise. That statement is going to become part of the trial record. And when it does, it's going to sit beside your documentation, your forensic timeline, your witness account, and the 11-minute phone call in which their client demonstrated direct knowledge of the animals at his facility. He paused. I want you to know that I'm going to enjoy that. Emily didn't smile, but something in her chest moved. Just get the conviction, she said. The arraignment was 3 days later. Holst arrived in a dark suit that cost more than Emily's motel bill for the entire month, flanked by 2 attorneys and an assistant who appeared to exist solely to carry things. He looked like a man who had spent 60 hours in federal holding, deciding that his posture was the one thing he could still control, and he was controlling it hard. Emily was in the gallery, not required to be there, but Whitfield had said her presence was not without strategic value, which she'd taken to mean that Holst seeing her there was useful. He saw her when he sat down. He looked at her for approximately 2 seconds, in the way of a man processing a situation he'd miscalculated. Then he looked away and didn't look back. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named the Honorable Martha Feld, and she ran her courtroom with the no-ceremony efficiency of someone who had seen every kind of defendant and was not going to let anyone waste her time. She read the charges in sequence: federal fraud, unlawful possession of government property, Animal Welfare Act violations across multiple counts, conspiracy to commit wire fraud in connection with the financial structure of the breeding operation, and the list was long enough that one of Holst's attorneys wrote something on a notepad and slid it to the other attorney, and Emily watched the second attorney read it and then look at the ceiling briefly. When Feld asked for the plea, Holst's lead attorney said, "Not guilty, Your Honor," in the tone of a man who had entered not guilty pleas before and understood that today's plea was mostly about buying time. Feld set a trial date and denied bail on the federal fraud charges pending a risk assessment, citing Holst's demonstrated flight behavior at the airstrip. In the gallery, Emily sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her face arranged into the neutral expression she'd learned years ago, in situations where what she was feeling had no useful place in what she needed to do. After the courtroom cleared, Rourke found her in the corridor. Paul Wren's cooperation agreement was finalized this morning, Rourke said. He's testifying. His documentation goes into evidence as a cooperating witness exhibit, which means it comes in with his credibility, not just as physical evidence. She looked at Emily. And the 3 additional properties, the ones outside Redstone City, all 3 were raided this morning, simultaneously, coordinated with the field offices. Emily turned to look at her. How many animals? 61 additional. Total across all 4 sites is now 84. Rourke held her gaze. Of the 84, 9 carry military tattoos. CID has verification requests pending on all 9. The ones they've confirmed so far, she paused. 4 of them are from the same missing animal reports that flagged in the original registry search. 9 military working dogs, across 4 sites, over what the financial records were showing as a 6-year operation. Emily looked at the courthouse wall. 6 years, she said. At least. Wren's records go back 11, but the animals don't appear in the transaction logs until 6 years ago. Before that, it was a smaller operation, more conventional. Rourke's voice was careful, the way it got when she was delivering information that had weight. The military animals were the expansion. Higher price point, different buyer profile. Someone at some point told Holst there was a market, and he found a way to supply it. Who told him? That's the next layer, Rourke said. Wren doesn't know. That's above his visibility in the structure. CID is working it. She looked at Emily steadily. It's going to take time. I want to be honest with you about that. I know. But here's what won't take time. Rourke pulled a folded document from inside her jacket and held it out. This was filed this morning by Brigadier General Falk's office. It's a formal commendation request submitted to the Army Human Resources Command, citing your role in surfacing the fraudulent record and initiating the chain of evidence that led to today's operation. She held it out until Emily took it. It also formally reopens the documentation of your status during your captivity period, which affects your service record, your benefits classification, and several things that have been in a kind of administrative limbo since you were repatriated. Emily unfolded the document. Read the first paragraph, then the second. The language was official and formal, which was appropriate, and underneath the official language were the facts. Her name, her unit, her service history, the 5 years of captivity, and a description of her actions over the past 2 weeks that was precise and unembellished and accurate. She folded it again. He didn't have to do that this fast, she said. No, Rourke agreed. He did it this fast because he chose to. Emily put the document in her folder, the same folder that had carried Shadow's chip scan and the fraudulent death record and Marcus Webb's corroborating statement and the call log from Holst's phone. The folder was thicker now than when she'd started. It was going to get thicker still because trials took time and documentation accumulated, and there were still 9 military working dogs whose stories needed to be told completely. She was prepared for that. She had more patience for the long work than most people expected, which was part of what had made her good at what she did, and part of what had kept her alive for 5 years in a place where patience was not optional. She walked out of the courthouse into the gray afternoon. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it, expecting Whitfield or Voss. It was a number she didn't recognize, local area code, and she almost let it go to voicemail. But she'd spent 2 weeks answering unfamiliar numbers because unfamiliar numbers turned out to matter, so she picked it up. Ms. Carter, a woman's voice. Careful, the way people are careful when they've rehearsed what they're going to say. My name is Diane Webb. You don't have any reason to— I know who you are, Emily said. A pause. I don't know exactly why I'm calling. I've been trying to figure out what to say for 3 days. Another pause. Marcus told me everything, not just what he told the federal agent, everything, from the beginning. Her voice was controlled, but the control had visible seams. I didn't know about any of it. I want you to know that. I know you don't have any reason to believe me. Emily walked down the courthouse steps and stopped at the bottom. What do you want, Diane? I don't want anything from you. She stopped. Started again. He used your dog to get money from Holst. That's what happened. He didn't know what Holst was going to do with her, but he took the money, and then when he found out pieces of what the money was connected to, he stayed quiet. For 3 years, he stayed quiet. Her voice wavered once and then steadied. I'm not calling to ask you to forgive him. I don't think you should. I'm calling because I found out yesterday that you've been staying in a motel for 3 weeks, and I have a friend with a house that's empty right now, and I thought... She stopped. It's a stupid thing to offer. I'm sorry. Emily stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps and looked at the gray street. It's not stupid, she said. She didn't know what else to say about it, so she left it there. There's a yard, Diane said, big enough for a dog. Emily looked at Shadow, who had come out of the car with Farrell. Farrell had been drafted into logistics support and had accepted it with the grim stoicism of a man who'd realized there was no graceful exit, and was sitting on the sidewalk watching Emily with the attentiveness she never dropped. Send me the address, Emily said. I'll think about it. She ended the call and stood there for a moment, the folder under her arm, the afternoon light thin and flat on the street, and she tried to work out what she felt about Diane Webb calling out of nowhere with an offer that was simultaneously inadequate and genuine. She couldn't resolve it into something clean, and she'd learned by now that not everything resolved into something clean, and that was acceptable. What she knew was this: Holst was in federal custody with a trial date and a cooperating witness and $4 million in documented revenue and a phone call he'd made to the wrong person. The 4 additional properties had been raided. 84 animals were in care. 9 military working dogs were being identified. The CID investigation was expanding into whatever layer above Holst had created the supply chain, and that would take time, but it would not be dropped, because Falk had said it would not be dropped, and Falk had the rank to mean it. And she had Shadow beside her on a sidewalk, and the puppy back at the safe house, and a commendation document in her folder and an offer of a house with a yard. She had started this 10 days ago with worn boots and a folder of documents and a certainty that no one else had shared. She had started it, and it had become something much larger than Shadow, and the part of her that was a soldier knew that was how it was supposed to go. One person pulling one thread, and the thread turned out to be load-bearing. She was still thinking about what came next when Rourke walked down the steps behind her and stopped beside her. "There's something you should know," Rourke said. "Holst's lead attorney contacted Whitfield's office an hour ago." Emily looked at her. "He's not entering a plea agreement," Rourke said. "He's going to trial." She paused. "And his strategy?" She stopped. Her expression had the careful flatness it got when the information was more complicated than the sentence. "His strategy is to make you the center of the case, not as the key witness, as the narrative." She looked at Emily directly. "His attorneys have hired a private investigator who spent the past 48 hours compiling a dossier on your repatriation, your psychological evaluations, your conduct in Redstone City since you returned, and..." She paused again. "Your relationship with Marcus Webb, the history of it, the nature of it. They're going to argue that this entire investigation was initiated and sustained by a woman with a personal vendetta, a compromised psychological profile, and a financial interest in discrediting Marcus Webb in order to reclaim property she believed she was owed." Emily was quiet for a moment. "They're going to put me on trial," she said. "They're going to try to," Rourke said. "Whitfield knows. Falk knows. The DoD clinical consultant's report goes into evidence as a counter. Your documentation is independent and verifiable, and none of it depends on your character." She paused. "But they're going to put that dossier in front of a jury. They're going to say everything they can say about who you are and what you've been through and what they say it made you capable of." The street was quiet. A bus went past on the main road a block away. "How complete is the dossier?" Emily asked. "Our office got a preliminary copy through Discovery." Rourke held her gaze. "There's something in it I wasn't aware of, something from your repatriation period. I don't know if you know we would find it." Emily looked at her steadily. "What is it?" Rourke reached into her jacket and produced a single printed page and held it out. Emily took it. It was a clinical note from the repatriation facility, not from her main psychological evaluation, but from a supplemental intake document filed in the first 72 hours after her return. The kind of document that got generated when someone said something in an initial intake interview that a clinician flagged for follow-up. She remembered the interview. She remembered what she'd said. She read the page. She read it again. The color didn't leave her face, but something in it changed. Some arrangement of muscle or attention, something that Rourke saw because Rourke was watching carefully. "Carter," Rourke said. "Whatever it is, it's not going to change the evidence." Emily folded the page and put it in her folder. "No," she said quietly. "It's not." But she understood, looking at the folder in her hands, that Holst's attorneys had found the one thing she hadn't given Rourke, the one piece of her history that she'd kept in a separate compartment because it was hers, and she hadn't thought it would be relevant, and she'd been wrong about that. Wrong, and it was going to cost her something in that courtroom. She didn't know yet how much. The clinical note was 8 lines. It had been written by a Dr. Simone Aberle, intake clinician at the repatriation facility, in the first 72 hours after Emily's return. The language was the careful, hedged language of clinical documentation, observational, non-diagnostic, flagged for follow-up. What it documented was a statement Emily had made in that first intake interview, when she'd been 31 hours out of a transport aircraft and hadn't slept in 2 days, and had been asked a routine question about whether she had any known family or personal contacts to notify. She had said, in words that Dr. Aberle had written down verbatim, "There's a dog. Her name is Shadow. She's the only thing I'm coming back for. If she's not there, I don't know what I come back to." That was it. 8 lines, one statement, made in a state of exhaustion and re-entry shock about a dog. Holst's attorneys were going to frame it as a woman so psychologically fragile and so fixated on the animal that her entire subsequent conduct was an expression of obsession rather than legitimate investigation. They were going to say she'd built a federal case on the foundation of one traumatized sentence spoken in a room she barely remembered. Emily stood on the courthouse steps and understood all of this in about 45 seconds, and then she put the page in her folder with everything else. "How long until trial?" she asked. "Whitfield's estimate is 4 months, minimum," Rourke said. "Possibly 6. The scope of the case has expanded significantly, and the defense will use every motion available to them to extend the timeline." "Then I have time to prepare." Rourke looked at her carefully. "Carter, the statement in that document, in context, knowing what you know now about why you came back and what you found—" "It's not a problem," Emily said. "It could be framed. I know how it could be framed." Emily looked at her. "I also know what I meant when I said it. I meant that Shadow was the thing I had to get back to. The responsibility, the partnership, the one living connection to who I was before 5 years of something I'd rather not explain in detail to a jury." She paused. "What I said was true. It's the most honest thing in that document. If Holst's attorneys want to put my honesty in front of a jury, let them." Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You need a good attorney." "I have resources now." Emily looked at the commendation document in her folder. Falk's office opened the benefits review. "I'm not staying in a $42 motel for much longer." Something eased in Rourke's expression. Not fully. Rourke didn't do fully eased, but enough to be visible. "Whitfield wants to prep you for testimony starting next month. Full sessions, not just the document review." "Tell him I'll be ready." She walked to the car where Shadow was waiting and got in. Well, the 4 months before trial were not peaceful, but they had a different quality than the 10 days that had preceded them. The 10 days had been pure forward motion. No sleep, no certainty, no ground under her feet that she could trust. The 4 months were work. Hard, grinding, detailed work. The kind she was built for. She moved into the house Diane Webb had arranged. It was a single-story place on the north side of Redstone City, belonged to a friend of Diane's who was working abroad, and it had a yard with a back fence and a kitchen that got afternoon light. Emily paid rent from the first back pay installment that came through once Falk's benefits review was processed, which was more than she'd expected and less than she was owed, and she didn't argue about it because arguing would take time she didn't have. She spent mornings with Whitfield's team running through testimony prep, and afternoons consulting with Kessler on the animal welfare side of the case. There were 84 animals whose conditions needed to be documented in medical and legal language, and Emily's clinical notes from the compound raid were part of the evidentiary record. She spent evenings in the yard with Shadow and the puppy, who had grown into a dog who was mostly ears and energy and an absolute conviction that every object on the ground was either a toy or a threat. She named the puppy Morse, because the dog communicated in a sequence of sounds that Emily had eventually decoded as something close to a pattern. Shadow watched Morse with the resigned patience of a senior employee observing a new hire who would eventually be fine but wasn't there yet. The CID investigation expanded, the way Falk had said it would. The internal access point, the person with military system credentials who'd processed Shadow's fraudulent death record, was identified in the second month. His name was Sergeant First Class Kenneth Rawls, supply chain coordinator, who had been supplementing his income for 4 years through a series of transactions that Wren's financial records made impossible to obscure. He was arrested on a Tuesday, quietly, and the arrest didn't make local news for 3 days. When it did, it was a single paragraph. Emily read it at the kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold and felt something she couldn't name exactly. Not satisfaction, because satisfaction was too simple for what SFC Rawls had done and what it had cost. Something more like the particular feeling of a long inventory that finally matches. She wrote it down in her notepad and added it to the file. The trial began on a cold Monday in November. Whitfield had told her what to expect, and she'd read enough trial documentation in the prep sessions to have a structural understanding of how it would go. What he hadn't fully conveyed, what couldn't be conveyed in prep sessions, was the texture of sitting in a federal courtroom and listening to an attorney describe you to a jury in language that was technically accurate in every individual word and comprehensively dishonest in every sentence. Holst's lead attorney was a man named Garrett Spence, and he was good. Emily gave him that without resentment, because competence was competence, and underestimating it was the kind of mistake that cost things. He was tall, deliberate, and had the particular skill of making sympathetic faces at exactly the right moments. His opening statement spent 40 minutes on the merits of the case and 11 minutes on Emily Carter, and those 11 minutes were precise and targeted and built the picture he'd been constructing since the motion to suppress. A woman in psychological recovery, a woman with documented attachment to a single animal, a woman whose stated reason for returning to Redstone City was that animal and nothing else, a woman whose former partner had moved on and who had responded by initiating a chain of events that had destroyed his life and the lives of others. She sat at the witness table on the third day and looked at Spence and did not look away from him when he did the thing that skilled attorneys do, held eye contact specifically to see if she'd flinch. She didn't flinch. She'd had 5 years of practice maintaining composure in situations where losing it had consequences she couldn't afford. He asked about the clinical note first. "Ms. Carter, I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 14, a clinical note from your intake interview at the repatriation facility." He held it up. "You're familiar with this document?" "Yes." "Would you read the flag statement for the jury, please?" She read it. Her voice was even. The words were hers and she claimed them. "You said Shadow was..." He glanced at his notes, a gesture she was certain was performed. "The only thing you were coming back for." That's what the document says. Is that an accurate representation of what you felt? It's an accurate representation of what I said in the first 72 hours after repatriation, in a state of sleep deprivation and re-entry disorientation, in response to a question about personal contacts. She paused. It's also true. Shadow was my partner for 2 years in a classified operational environment. Maintaining that responsibility was part of what kept me functional during captivity. When I came back and found a fraudulent death record where her history should have been, I began to investigate. Those are the facts in sequence. Spence moved through his questions with the patient persistence of a man working a structure he'd built carefully. The psychological evaluations. Her motel room. The fact that she'd withheld the compound address from Rourke initially. The fact that she'd answered Holst's phone call instead of immediately reporting it. Each question was designed to make a reasonable action look like an irrational one, to make a competent investigation look like a fixation. She answered every question in the same register. Direct, factual, no embellishment, no defensiveness. She'd been prepped extensively, but she didn't sound prepped, because the thing about telling the truth in sequence is that it doesn't require rehearsal. It requires memory. The cross-examination took 4 hours. When Whitfield stood up for redirect, he asked her 3 questions. "Ms. Carter, the chip scan documentation you submitted, did you falsify any part of it?" "No." "The fraudulent death record you identified, did you create it or cause it to be created?" "No." The 84 animals recovered from 4 sites across 2 states. Did you fabricate the conditions they were found in? No. Whitfield sat down. Nothing further. Wren testified for 2 days and was meticulous. He had the particular credibility of a man who was not trying to seem credible. He was flat, detailed, and frequently said things that reflected poorly on himself without being prompted, which juries read accurately as someone telling the truth rather than a story. His financial documentation went in as exhibits and was, as Whitfield had said months ago, complete. Every transaction, every LLC, every buyer account and pricing structure and wire transfer across 6 years of operation. Darren Holst, on his attorney's advice, did not testify. Emily thought about that choice, about a man who had called her on the phone with the confidence of someone who had never been genuinely held accountable for anything, who had described her living situation as a means of intimidating her, who had told her the picture she had was incomplete, and who sat now in a federal courtroom and said nothing, because saying nothing was his best remaining option. She watched him from the gallery during Wren's second day of testimony. He was controlled, still, expensive. He looked like a man waiting for a situation to resolve in his favor, and the longer she watched him, the more clearly she could see that the waiting was all he had left. The jury was out for 11 hours. Emily spent those hours at the house on the north side with Shadow in the yard and Morse attempting to catch a leaf that kept evading her. She didn't pace. She'd paced enough in her life to know it didn't change anything, and she'd spent 5 years in circumstances where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and she'd learned to use waiting time rather than let it use her. She reorganized her files. She wrote up her observations from the compound raid in a format that Kessler had requested for the Animal Welfare Unit's case documentation. She ate a real meal, which she'd been forgetting to do with any consistency for months. When Rourke called, Emily was in the backyard with her jacket on and both dogs at her feet. "Verdict's in," Rourke said. Emily stood up. Guilty. On all counts. The fraud counts, the possession counts, the Animal Welfare Act violations. Every charge that Whitfield had built the case around came back the same way. Holst's expression when the last count was read was the expression of a man who had run out of versions of a situation where he was not responsible. The sentencing was 6 weeks later. 12 years federal, no early release on the fraud charges under mandatory minimums, full financial forfeiture including the LLCs and the property holdings, and the accounts that Wren's documentation had mapped. Holst Property Group was dissolved by court order. The mansion in the city, the one Emily had stood outside in the rain in worn boots and electrical tape boots, was ordered liquidated and the proceeds directed to the animal welfare organizations that had absorbed the cost of caring for 84 animals. Spence filed 2 post-trial motions. Judge Feld denied both within the week, with a written opinion that described the evidence as extensive, independently verifiable, and compelling in its consistency. The phrase independently verifiable appeared 3 times in the opinion. Emily read it twice and thought about Dr. Osmond staying late for a scan that mattered. Garrett Finch keeping a dog he didn't have the resources for because he knew she shouldn't be where she was. Kessler in the compound with her gray hair and her efficient hands. Rourke on a bumper in a parking lot being more honest with her than she needed to be. It had never been one person. It had been one person who started pulling and then held on while other people decided it was worth holding on to. SFC Rawls was sentenced separately, 8 years, dishonorable discharge, reduction in rank, and forfeiture of retirement benefits. His cooperation with the CID investigation on the broader supply chain earned him a reduced sentence from what he'd been facing initially, but not by much. His name was entered permanently into the DoD fraud registry, which meant he would never work in or adjacent to any military-connected system for the rest of his life. The other animals in the supply chain network, beyond Holst's 4 sites, took another 8 months to trace fully. Emily was not involved in that work directly, but Rourke kept her informed, and the number at the end was larger than anything Nasser's initial estimate had suggested. The investigation had eventually connected Holst to a loose network of 3 other operators in different states, none of them as large individually, all of them feeding into the same buyer market. By the time federal charges were finalized across all connected defendants, 11 people had been indicted. Every one of them pled or was convicted. Every military working dog that could be identified was either returned to active service, placed in an official retirement program, or in the cases where medical condition made those options unrealistic, placed in specialized long-term care with organizations equipped to handle their needs. Chud. The Army's formal recognition came on a Thursday morning in March, 7 months after the verdict. It was not a large ceremony. Emily hadn't wanted a large ceremony and had said so clearly enough that Falk had stopped arguing about it in the second conversation on the subject. It was a room in a federal building in Redstone City, 37 people, chairs set up in rows, someone's assistant with a camera. Voss was there, standing at the back with his arms crossed, looking like a man attending something he approved of but didn't want to be caught approving of. Rourke was there. Whitfield, Kessler, Dr. Osman, Garrett Finch, who had driven in from the rail district and was wearing a shirt that still had a crease in it. Shadow was there, which required a brief and mildly tense conversation with the building's facilities manager that Falk resolved with the particular authority of a man with a star on his collar. Morse was not there, because Morse at 8 months old was unpredictable around large groups of chairs, and Emily had made a tactical decision. Falk gave a short address that was not about Emily as a person, which was what she'd asked for. It was about the investigation, about the evidence, about what it meant institutionally that a fraudulent military record had been used to erase the existence of a working animal, and that the person who found it was a soldier who'd been gone for 5 years and came back to a city that had moved on without her, and started pulling a thread anyway. He read the formal commendation language in a voice that made it clear he meant it, and Emily stood in her dress uniform, back on her, properly fitted now, the ribbons she'd earned in the right places, and received the commendation and the formal reinstatement of her complete service record and the correction of her status classification. She didn't feel the way she'd expected to feel. She'd thought it might feel like closure, the way people describe closure, some door shutting cleanly, some weight setting down. What it actually felt like was simpler and less dramatic. It felt like a fact being corrected, like a column of numbers that had been wrong for years being made right, and the rightness of it was solid and real, but it wasn't theatrical. The 5 years had been real. The motel had been real. The boots held together with electrical tape had been real. The commendation didn't undo any of it. It just added the true record beside the surviving one and let them exist together. When Falk shook her hand, he held it a beat longer than protocol required and said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, "You were good at this before. You're still good at it." She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." Shadow was at heel beside her throughout the ceremony without being commanded to it, and when Emily finally crouched down and put her hands on either side of the dog's face, Shadow pressed into her palms with the full weight of a dog who had stopped managing her trust in small portions. "She knew exactly who you were," Emily said softly. She'd said those words before, once, in a different context, had imagined saying them to Marcus across the gate outside that mansion, and then hadn't needed to say them to Marcus at all, because the story had resolved in a way that made the words unnecessary for him and necessary for herself. Shadow leaned her forehead against Emily's. They moved north in April. It wasn't a dramatic move. Emily packed what she had, which wasn't much because she'd spent years in places where you carried everything you owned and had never completely broken herself of the habit of traveling light, and drove 6 hours into the mountains in a truck she'd bought used and which had an opinion about hills but ran. She'd found a small property through a contact of Kessler's, 2 acres at the edge of a national forest, a house that had been empty long enough to need work and was priced accordingly. The work was fine. Emily had always been better with her hands than with waiting, and the house gave her something useful to do with the mornings. The mountains were quiet in a way that the city wasn't. Not silent. There was wind and wildlife and the irregular percussion of a house that was still settling into the cold, but quiet in the deeper sense, the sense of absence of the particular pressure that cities generate. She'd spent 5 years in a kind of enforced quiet that was nothing like this. And she'd spent months since repatriation in a city that hummed with the noise of a life she'd lost the thread of. This was different. This was chosen. She rebuilt her fitness slowly because her body had opinions about pace that 5 years of captivity and 1 year of forensic reconstruction had installed in her permanently, and she'd learned not to argue with it. Morning runs on forest roads, evenings in the yard with both dogs. Morse at 8 months was a creature of absolute conviction and zero common sense, and watching Shadow manage her with the patience of someone who had been through worse was something Emily found herself looking at sometimes and thinking about what survives specifically, about the things that go deep enough that circumstance can't reach them. Shadow had spent years in conditions that should have broken her willingness to trust, and here she was in a yard in the mountains teaching a puppy to navigate the perimeter fence with the methodical attention of a dog who still believed the work mattered. Some things go deep enough that they hold. Emily didn't spend a lot of time thinking about Darren Holst. He was in a federal facility, his assets were liquidated, his operation was dismantled, and the network he'd been connected to was the subject of ongoing prosecutions that didn't require her involvement. She checked in with Rourke occasionally and with Whitfield when a document needed her signature, and the rest of the time she let it exist in the part of her mind where completed work goes, done, accounted for, no longer requiring active attention. What she thought about more, and with more complexity, was the question she'd written in her notepad that first night in the Pine Brook Inn. Who benefits from Shadow being dead on paper? The answer had been Holst and Rawls and the supply chain and the money. But the deeper answer, the one underneath the legal answer, was that everyone benefits when someone is erased on paper. Everyone who doesn't want to be held accountable benefits when the person who can hold them accountable is classified as missing or compromised or unreliable or too damaged by what they've been through to be trusted with their own story. She'd come back from 5 years of captivity, and a fraudulent death record had been used to make her partner disappear. A press statement had tried to make her own account disappear. A clinical note from her worst week of re-entry had been used to suggest that her clarity was pathology. And she had been too tired and too broke and too recently returned from somewhere she didn't talk about in detail. And she had stood in the rain outside a mansion, and none of it had mattered because she had one folder and one thread and the patience of someone who'd spent 5 years learning that survival is not a feeling. It's a decision you make again every morning until the situation changes. She'd kept making it. She was making it still. In May, Kessler called to say that 3 of the 9 confirmed military working dogs had been cleared for placement after their recovery period and were being matched with veteran handlers through an official program. The other 6 were in long-term specialized care, and 2 of them had made enough progress that the prognosis for eventual placement was considered good. She gave Emily the update in the same flat, efficient voice she used for everything, and then said, before she hung up, "The compound report you filed. It went into the training documentation for our unit's field response protocol, your intake assessment process." "The rapid assessment sequence," Emily said. "We're using it now. It's cleaner than what we had." A pause. "I wanted you to know that." Emily said thank you and meant it and let Kessler hang up first. She stood in the kitchen with afternoon light on the floor and thought about what it meant that a sequence of actions she'd performed by instinct in a metal building that smelled like ammonia was now written down somewhere, formalized, being taught to people who would use it in the next situation and the one after that. She wasn't sentimental about it, but she noted it, the way she noted everything that meant the record was complete. The record was complete. She went out to the yard. Shadow was in the late afternoon sun near the back fence, and Morse was beside her, and both of them looked up when Emily came through the door. Shadow's tail moved once, the same single motion as that first night in Garrett Finch's machine shop, the same question, now answered so many times it had become a statement. Emily sat down in the grass. Shadow came and settled against her left side, the way she had always worked. Close, attentive, present. The mountains were doing what mountains do in the late afternoon, going blue at the edges, the light going long across the grass, the kind of quiet that asks nothing from you. Emily had been dismissed and documented, committed and classified and erased and repatriated and doubted and formally recognized, and she had come out the other side of all of it, not because she was exceptional in the way stories sometimes suggest, not because she was invincible or fearless or operating at some perfect pitch of competence that lesser people couldn't reach. She was none of those things. She'd been scared in that compound. She'd been wrong about the clinical note. She'd missed sleep and eaten badly and sat in a parking lot at midnight second-guessing herself and needed other people's expertise and held on to Rourke's bumper with both hands metaphorically more than once. What she'd had was a folder and a thread and the willingness to keep pulling. That was the whole of it. That was the thing that had built the case and brought down the operation and put 12 years behind a man in a dark suit who had believed that a woman with a fraudulent motel address and electrical tape on her boots was not a serious problem. The underestimation of people who have survived things is one of the most consistent mistakes that comfortable people make. They look at the worn boots and the cheap motel and the complicated history and they see diminished. They don't see what the worn boots mean. They don't see what it costs to keep moving forward in them day after day, in a city that moved on without you, pulling a thread that everyone else decided wasn't there. She looked at Shadow in the late afternoon light. Gray muzzle, old scar on her flank, eyes still sharp and still entirely present, and thought about the way the dog had survived. Not cleanly, not without damage, but completely, in the only way that actually counts. Morse put her chin on Emily's knee and looked up at her with the absolute confidence of an animal who had never had a reason to doubt that the person beside her would handle whatever came next. Emily put her hand on the puppy's head. The mountains went blue. The record was complete, and the work that came next was hers to choose. And she was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she had decided to be.